Alright, hi everybody, how's it going? And welcome to another video. Now, it's been a while since I've done a video, but I want to do a video today. Now, in the past, I've done some videos on various rock and metal bands. I've done some album reviews. Well, I want to do something along those lines today. Recently, there's been a musician in the news a bit. Various publications have been talking about him. He's had a very long career, and I have been a fan of his for a while, so I thought I would do a video where I talk about this individual. The individual I'm referring to is Alice Cooper. So this is going to be a video on Alice Cooper. I'm going to talk about the history of the band and whatnot, and then I'm going to do a second video, and in the second video I'm going to talk about my 10 favorite Alice Cooper albums, and I'm also going to talk about 5 that I don't really care for a whole lot. So, someone like Alice Cooper, I've chosen 10 because he just has a very large discography. He's been around. The Alice Cooper band started actually in 1964, and altogether there are 28 Alice Cooper albums. But, more on that later, because there's also an Alice Cooper band, and then there's a solo project. So there are 2 different bands there. But anyways, getting back to Alice Cooper. So Alice Cooper formed in 1964 at Cortez High School, which is located in the north of Phoenix, Arizona. And it's kind of interesting how they formed. They kind of have an interesting origin because it kind of formed by accident. These guys who were on a track team would run around a track, and as they would run around the track, they would sing parodies of Beatles songs as they would do it. They would make the Beatles songs comical. So then they thought, why don't we make, comedic versions of Beatles songs and then sing them at the talent show. So they thought they would do that. They got the only one who was a musician at this time to join them, and that was Glenn Buxton, who would later become the lead guitarist of the Alice Cooper group. He joined them, and they began, coming up with these Beatle parody songs. And then, to their amazement, they ended up winning the talent show. So it went over real well. A lot of people liked it, and they thought, what? Why don't we turn this into an actual band? So the other members began learning instruments. They got a rhythm guitarist, an individual by the name of John Tatum. They got a drummer named John Spear, and Dennis Dunaway was the bass player. Vince Furnier was the singer. And, like I said, Glenn Buxton, the lead guitarist, he was the only one at this point in time that knew how to play an instrument, but they began to learn. And they then started to get good. They began to perform in the area around Phoenix, and they would perform at these teen clubs. Now, one thing you used to have in the late 60s as well as the early 70s were these teen clubs. And I've heard about these teen clubs. I've heard people talk about them. And the way it was at this time is you could go to one of these teen clubs and you could see, people like Ted Nugent performing, or Cream, or The Who, or the Yardbirds. Just all these major bands would perform at these teen clubs. So it was really something at this time in the late 60s and into the 70s, that you had this. It was really something. Now, a lot of these teen clubs did end up getting shut down because apparently there would be a lot of fighting in the parking lots a lot of the time. So they did shut down all these places. But yeah, I've heard people talk about these before. And Alice Cooper, or the band that would become Alice Cooper, right now when they started in 1964, they called themselves the Earwigs, and they would play at these clubs, opening for bands like the Byrds and the Yardbirds. If I'm not mistaken, I think Alice Cooper, his favorite band is the Yardbirds. But they would open for these bands, and they began to become better well known in the Phoenix area. They then changed their name to the Spiders because they had this theory, based on the Beatles, that if you named your band after a bug, you would hit it big because the Beatles. So that's what they did. They changed the name to the Spiders. They then changed it to another name called the Nas, but Todd Rundgren had the name the Nas. So then, and I believe it was in 1968, they changed the name to Alice Cooper. Now, no one in the band was named Alice Cooper at this point. The singer was named Vince Fournier. No one had the name Alice Cooper. And the reason why they chose that name, kind of like, Jethro Tull, there's no one in the band Jethro Tull named Jethro Tull. Same with like Alice Cooper. There's no one in the band named Alice Cooper. They just kind of thought that it sounded kind of like a Lizzie Borden or something like that, or it had like an innocent sound to them. And immediately people would react when they heard that name, because it was an unusual name, and it would immediately give people some kind of a reaction when they heard it. So they went with that name, and like I said, they began performing more places. They then decided, I want to say it was actually in 67, they decided to head out to Los Angeles for the first time to try to make it as a band. Now, 1967 in that area, was known as the Summer of Love. There were a lot of bands out there trying to make it. I think I've been told there were at least, like 3,000 to 5,000 musicians trying to make it in the music business at this point. They were going out there performing, hoping to be discovered and hoping to be signed to a record label, preferably like a major label. And that was what Alice Cooper did. They all got like an apartment together. They stayed in an apartment. They didn't have a lot of food, but yet at the same time, they would play shows with bands like Pink Floyd, and they would be like, Pink Floyd, who are they? So, it was Pink Floyd's first U.S. tour. Pink Floyd stayed with the Alice Cooper band when they were in Los Angeles. So, yeah, that's something else to think. Syd Barrett was still in the band at that time. But, yeah, so, they also performed with Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin was another band, and I remember they said that they were like, who are Led Zeppelin? Who are they? Because, it's the first Led Zeppelin tour. So, even though they were broke musicians and they didn't have a lot of food, they were having these incredible experiences performing with what are now legendary bands. Also, the Doors. The Alice Cooper band would play lots of shows with the Doors, and they would hang out with the Doors quite a bit. They would be, friends. They would be good friends with that band. And what then happened is, they would get evicted from different apartments. And eventually they got a house. I want to say it was Topanga Canyon. And they moved into this house, and they would have parties. And, one event that happened there was a seance. And they had a seance with Jim Morrison, David Crosby of the Byrds, I believe a major representative of Elektra Records. I'm not sure if it was the CEO or what, but yeah, that individual was there. And for some reason, the press actually reported this seance. I guess they were having a seance, the Alice Cooper band, with Jim Morrison, like I said. And while they were having this seance, they got to a point in the seance where they were kind of like, if spirits, if you can hear us, give us a sign. And supposedly, right when that happened, the lead guitarist Glenn Buxton had fallen through a trap door and like fell to the ground. He was okay, he wasn't hurt, but everyone was absolutely frightened when this happened, because just so happened to happen at that moment. So yeah, just interesting stories. You listen to Alice Cooper talk, he's got a story about just about every major legendary, rock or metal musician. I mean, he really does. But anyways, they were still, trying to make it big. One thing I should mention was they began developing kind of an elaborate stage show, and that was because the bass player Dennis Dunaway was going to move to New York to try to make it in the art world, but they said, you know what, if you stay, you could help design sets and you'll be able to do art in this band. So Dennis Dunaway agreed. He agreed to it. So right from the get-go, they were developing a stage show. So pretty much right from the get-go. And it would become more elaborate as time would go on, having things like guillotines and snakes. But they then began working on their first album. The first album, they were playing the songs. Apparently the drummer that they had, John Spear, thought that the album was too weird. He thought their material was way out there. And it was. That first album they put out, Pretty's for You, I mean, had a lot of different sounding tunes on it. I mean, it really did. You'd have, I think, like 3-minute songs with like 30 different changes in them and all these tempo changes, all sorts of different things. So it was really out there. There was a Beatles and a Doors influence on it, but, there was also some other influence, and I think it was the influence of, and I don't remember his name, but like a German surrealistic composer who was composing different types of like surrealistic and atonal type symphonies, and they're influenced by that composer. But the drummer said, yeah, this was too weird. I thought we were going to be like the Beatles. I don't understand what we're doing. This stuff is not going to be put on the radio, so I'm out. So their drummer, John Spear, left, and he was replaced by another drummer, a guy by the name of Neil Smith. And Neil Smith also had a sister named Cindy who designed the Alice Cooper Band costumes, designed these elaborate costumes for him. Because I think at one point they agreed that they weren't just going to be a band that would go on stage in t-shirts and jeans. They were going to wear costumes. And that's what they did. And then they tried to get, record deal. No one would sign them. They almost got a record deal with, I believe it was Mercury Records. They went in for an audition. The people there, the executives, liked what they heard, but they said the singer's got to go. So they were like, nope, we're in this together. So that fell apart. But they did catch the interest of Frank Zappa, who just started a record label called Straight Records, and he was looking for weird bands that weren't getting signed anywhere else. He was looking for strange, yet creative and unusual, experimental type bands, and the Alice Cooper Band definitely were that. Another band that he had signed at this time was a band called the GTOs, and he signed another one called Captain Beefheart and Wildman Fisher. So he had different bands that, like I said, weren't getting signed to any of the major labels. And he signed the Alice Cooper Band. There's a story where he said, okay, come over to my house at 7, not specifying AM or PM. They show up at AM. He's like, I think I might sign these guys. So then he had liked what he heard. They recorded an album at his, I think he had a studio on his property I think it was in Laurel Canyon. And I believe he had a studio there. That's where they recorded the first album. Now, supposedly at some point in recording the album, I think he got bored of having a record label. Depends on what story you're reading or listening to. I've heard different versions, but I heard that one version that he just got bored of having a record label. He didn't want to do it anymore. So he had one of the members of the Mothers of Invention, I believe it was the keyboardist, finish the recording. And then they had the album out, and the album, like I said, it's a strange album. You know, that first Alice Cooper album, Pretty's for You, is a strange album. You know, it's not like anything else you would ever hear. You know, the bass player Dennis Dunaway's even said that, you know. It's not like anything else you would ever hear. And an interesting side note, the bass player had met Michael J. Fox, and Michael J. Fox said, I could play every guitar part off of Pretty's for You. And Dennis Dunaway was like, that's great to hear because we can't do that. But anyways, shortly after that, they began work on their second album, Easy Action. And the producer of that album, I believe, was the individual who was a producer for Neil Young and Crazy Horse. And he produced the Alice Cooper band. Supposedly, he didn't like the band. He thought their sound was psychedelic trash. That's what he said. And at this point, they were kind of developing their sound more. The second album, I think, he has kind of more of like definitely like a Doors influence, but also like I could hear a Quicksilver Messenger Service influence on that. I could definitely hear that. But yeah, anyways, they put out their second album pretty quickly. Neither album, you know, did anything. I don't believe they sold very well. At this point, they needed, you know, that hit song on the radio. They needed to put out an album that would be big. And they had a manager. They met their manager, Shep Gordon, who's still Alice Cooper's manager to this day, in '68, I believe. And they had decided that their sound didn't really fit in with the LA sound. They didn't really have that sort of long song jam band kind of sound that you had in like places like San Francisco. So they decided that they were going to go to Detroit because at this time, Detroit was becoming known for having harder rock. It was known for having bands that were a bit more gritty, were heavier, you know, had a dirtier sound. You know, that's what Detroit was known for at this time. You know, and they then went to Detroit. They got a farmhouse in Pontiac, Michigan. That's where they stayed. And then they were looking for a producer. They wanted the producer who had produced the Guess Who albums, but he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to work with them. So he sent his new assistant to work with the band, and that was Bob Ezrin. Bob Ezrin was very young at this time, and he saw potential in the Alice Cooper band. Now, he did not teach the Alice Cooper band how to play their instruments. He did not. They already knew that. And the members of the band make that clear. You know, he didn't teach them how to play their instruments, but he did show them how to make their songs like more radio friendly so they could get that hit single played on the radio, because that's what they wanted. That's what they were shooting for. And, you know, hopefully they could then sell albums this time around with their third album. They began working on their third album. Like I said, they were in Pontiac, Michigan, just outside Detroit. And they then put out their first album. This was their their third album, rather. They put out their third album, and it was this one right here. This is the album known as Love It to Death. This is the album that really broke the band, really made them famous. It was that album right there, Love It to Death. They began playing with other bands in the Detroit area. I should say something about the Detroit scene, because you had bands like, Mitch Ryder, you had Bob Seger, Suzi Quatro, you had Iggy and the Stooges, you had the MC5, you had some other lesser-known bands like the Third Power, Frost, Frigid Pink. There was really a pretty big scene there, for the most part. I mean, there was a good-sized scene. And like I said, these were harder rock bands. Some of them were even what you would call like proto-punk. Sometimes they're called garage rock bands. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to these bands as proto-punk. So they put out their third album, Love It to Death. It began getting a lot of radio play because it had songs on it like Caught in a Dream, I'm 18. And I'm 18 was like, their first big hit. The Long Way to Go, The Ballad of Dwight Fry. So, it had those songs on it. And those songs became part of their, stage show. The Ballad of Dwight Fry, I mean, that's kind of a freaky song, if you think about it. I mean, it really kind of is. That's where Alice comes out in the straitjacket, and he's basically playing an inmate in a mental institution. And he's kind of singing about that. Now, this kind of shows that, this was 1971, and the Alice Cooper Band were going to be a different band. They weren't singing about what other bands were singing about, sock hops and cars and parties and, that kind of stuff. They were more, focusing on kind of like the darker side of life at that point. Not that there's anything wrong with things like, sock hops and cars and parties or anything like that, but they were just kind of adding a whole other like dimension to rock and roll, that a lot of bands weren't doing at that point. Bands like Black Sabbath were, and Alice Cooper establishing themselves as, one of the early bands of heavy metal. I think you had bands at this point that were putting heavy songs on albums, but you weren't getting, full heavy albums. Now bands are coming out that were pretty heavy, like, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, and Alice Cooper. And those are what I consider to be, the first four, like, big metal bands or bands that influenced metal. But, that really did. Alice Cooper were very influential. Primarily, I think a lot in image. They really gave metal its, kind of like a dark image. Although Black Sabbath were already doing that. I know Arthur Brown was doing some of that in England. He was doing the thing with the face paint. I think he had white face paint. And then he had kind of like this like design going across. And Alice Cooper would do something like that, but he'd put like lines in his eyes, or sometimes it would be like a spider. That's what Alice Cooper would do. And, so they were becoming bigger and bigger, a better, more well-known band. There are some songs off of the third album that clearly are, influenced by the Doors, songs like Black Juju. Because like I said, they were good friends with the Doors. They were. So, you could hear a Doors influence on the Alice Cooper music. I even think in Alice Cooper's vocal style, I even think you could hear a Jim Morrison influence. He has, I think, a couple different, maybe even a few different vocal styles that he uses. But I think you could kind of hear that Jim Morrison influence. Now, the Alice Cooper Band then recorded their fourth album. Their fourth album was this one right here, Killer. It's got the head of a of a snake on it, as you can see. This snake was a snake that they got from one of their concerts in Florida. Someone just left a boa constrictor on the stage. The drummer decided to make it as his pet. It actually became the drummer's pet. So, yeah, Neil Smith. Yeah, they're just some great songs off of here. Under My Wheels, Halos of Flies, Desperado, Killer. I believe Desperado's about Jim Morrison. And then after that album, they had another big hit on this album, School's Out, with the song School's Out, the title track. This album's kind of interesting. It just shows that the Alice Cooper Band was very creative when it came to album packaging. I mean, look at this. This is kind of like a desk, a school desk, and every band member kind of carved their initials into the desk. And supposedly, if you had the record of this, it would flip open just like a desk. So yeah, they had some creative and innovative packaging. They really did. Some very creative, kind of innovative packaging ideas, that's for sure. But yeah, this is the School's Out album. And like I said, the song School's Out, massive hit. Just a massive hit. And they began becoming more and more famous at this point from albums like that as well. They then put out, after that one, this album, which was Billion Dollar Babies. This is my favorite Alice Cooper album, Billion Dollar Babies. Got some great songs on this one. Hello, Hooray, Elected, Billion Dollar Babies, No More Mr. Nice Guy, Generation Landslide. Just great tracks on this. Great tracks. Now, I first heard Alice Cooper. The first song I heard was not actually from the Alice Cooper Band. It was actually off of the first Anthrax album. Anthrax covered the song I'm 18. And that was the first time I heard an Alice Cooper song. For whatever reason, I don't believe Scott Ian played on that song. For whatever reason, I forgot what it was. But yeah, that was the first time I heard Alice Cooper. I began hearing about him in 1989 because I was listening to something at the time, and my mom was kind of like, so who's the shock rocker of today? Because in my day, it used to be this guy named Alice Cooper. So, and I think I had already heard of Alice Cooper at that point because it was 1989 and he had just come out with the album Trash, which had the hit song on it, Poison. So, just thought I'd mention that a bit, when I first heard Alice Cooper, because he had No More Mr. Nice Guy. And again, the first time I heard No More Mr. Nice Guy, it was not off of this album, but it was actually from the movie Shocker, and the Shocker soundtrack. Megadeth covered the song on that. Megadeth covered No More Mr. Nice Guy. So, yeah, they just kept putting out albums. I mean, there are a lot of bands back in the 70s that just kept putting out album after album after album. I mean, it was just like, album tour, constantly writing on the road. That's what bands were doing a lot of, lots of writing at this point. Then they put out Muscle of Love. This is the last album with the Alice Cooper Band. So they put out this album. A little bit of glare here. Pull it back. But yeah, this is the Alice Cooper Band, the last album they put out. This album actually has what appears to be kind of like a stain on the bottom. And basically the story behind that is apparently when the album came out, record stores were returning the album thinking it was damaged. So, yeah, and that it's not as highly regarded as Billion Dollar Babies, but I know fans do like it. And that was the Alice Cooper Band. Now, there's two bands here. The Alice Cooper Band then broke up in 1974. And, what caused the breakup, could be any of a number of things. Apparently what happened is they were on the road so much, writing so many songs, that they all kind of agreed, okay, you know what, let's take maybe a year off or so, maybe 2 years, and, let's then come back together and we'll continue this. Because Alice Cooper was, Vince Furnier, I should mention, had changed his name at this point to Alice Cooper. So now he was known as Alice Cooper. And he was drinking quite heavily. I guess Glenn Buxton, the lead guitarist, he was drinking quite a bit. They felt that, maybe they should take a rest. However, while they're doing this, the rhythm guitarist, Michael Bruce, decided that he wanted to put out a solo album to release some songs that he wrote that wouldn't fit into the spectrum of Alice Cooper. It wouldn't fit into it. So he decided that he wanted to put out this solo album. Now, Michael Bruce, I will say this, he's kind of the unsung member of the Alice Cooper Band. He wrote a lot of the hit songs. Very talented musician. He also played a lot of keyboards. A lot of the keyboards you hear on these Alice Cooper group albums is Bob Ezrin, but he did a lot of keyboards too. And then what happened was they agreed that they were going to do solo albums. So Michael Bruce said, he was going to do this solo album. Then the drummer was like, okay, I think I want to do one. Dennis Dunaway, the bass player, didn't want to do a solo album. He wanted to keep the band going. But Glenn Buxton, from what I understand, he didn't do a solo album. And Alice Cooper wasted no time and began working along with Bob Ezrin to put together this real big solo album project called Welcome to My Nightmare. That was going to be the name of his first solo album. And if the album did good, he would keep going with the solo project. If it didn't do good and if it flopped, he would go back to the Alice Cooper Band. That's what he was thinking of doing. Well, he had this big production for Welcome to My Nightmare. Here's the cover of it, the cover of Alice Cooper's Welcome to My Nightmare album. And he had this real big production. In fact, they even made it into an ABC special, where it sort of like showed you the nightmare of this individual by the name of Stephen, and basically made the nightmare and showed people what the nightmare was. Various like music videos, essentially what they were. And like I said, it became an ABC special. There were dancers that were a part of this. Vincent Price was a part of this. So and the album sold well. So he felt no need to go back to the Alice Cooper Band. He kept with his Alice Cooper solo project and has been releasing albums, as a solo artist ever since. Occasionally he would bring members back from the Alice Cooper Band, but, after 1974, that was it for the Alice Cooper Band. The band had broken up. So a lot of people don't know that. I didn't realize that there were two bands, the Alice Cooper Band and then the Alice Cooper solo project, until Wikipedia came about. I didn't even know that. You could kind of see what Alice Cooper did, because he knew, people were associating Alice Cooper with the singer. That's just kind of what people did at the time. People thought that the singer of Jethro Tull, Ian Anderson, they thought his name was Jethro Tull, which it wasn't. But they thought that, the name Alice Cooper was Alice Cooper. So that's why he changed his name to that. Then when he went solo, no one knew that there was an Alice Cooper Band. The Alice Cooper Band members just weren't that famous. I mean, they just weren't. It was just kind of how it was. That happens in bands sometimes. It's like Aerosmith. It's like not, everyone knows who Joe Perry is, everyone knows who Steven Tyler is, but not as many people know who Tom Hamilton and Brad Whitford are. So, it was like that in the Alice Cooper band. Not a lot of people knew who the band was. So, they basically were left to do their own solo albums, and I don't believe any of them did well from what I understand. They got together as a band called Billion Dollar Babies and put out an album called Battle Axe, which I don't believe sold very well. But Alice Cooper, because everyone thought that, okay, this is still the Alice Cooper band. It's called Alice Cooper. It wasn't really an information age at that time. You couldn't look things up, and the casual fans didn't know the difference, like I said. And then Alice Cooper began putting out more and more albums. I should say a greatest hits album did come out. I like this cover, too. Probably one of my favorite covers. They're kind of like dressed as gangsters. Like 30s gangsters. But, yeah. But, that actually sold well, too, that greatest hits album. It came out in 1974. And then, Alice Cooper kept putting out more albums. Put out albums like Alice Cooper Goes to Hell. This was another one. Around this time, he began appearing on things like The Muppets and that. And I guess people had mixed feelings about that. Then his drinking was really bad, so he went into a sanitarium to try to get better. He put out this album called, was called From the Inside. You hear him in interviews where he's like, I'm in a sanitarium and I'm in heaven because everyone hears a song. So supposedly this was based on his time in the sanitarium that he had gone into. And then he came out. I think he stopped drinking for a little bit, but then it relapsed. And after that, he put out this album, Flush the Fashion. He did put out another one that I had forgot to mention. Actually, not too big a fan of it. It was Lace and Whiskey. I do like the title track, though. This album I didn't really like at all. This album, Flush the Fashion. So this was an album that he had put out. Like I said, not really too big into this one. But the reason why I'm not into Flush the Fashion is, I'll get more into this in my next video, but I felt like they were trying to, maybe it was the record company that was doing this, but I felt like they were trying to morph Alice Cooper into this like Gary Newman type new wave figure. Personally, I'm not as big a fan of the new wave material that Alice Cooper put out. Just not as big a fan of it because I didn't think it really worked very well for him. Harder rock and metal, I think, worked much better than the new wave stuff. Also, like From the Inside, I should mention, has a very like show tuney kind of sound to it. Now, some people absolutely love this album, and some people don't. Some people will say this is the best Alice Cooper album. If you like the sort of show tuney type Alice Cooper, I think you would like it. But if not, you probably won't like it as much. I myself wasn't too big into it. I didn't really care for it a whole lot. But, it's all a matter of perception, right? Some people absolutely love that album. Now, around this time, Alice Cooper entered what's called his blackout period. He had Flush the Fashion. Then he had the album, believe it was Special Forces after that. Then Zipper Catches Skin. Then he had the album Dada, which has this album cover right here. There's a copy of like a Salvatore Dali painting. Salvatore Dali apparently was a fan of Alice Cooper. He met Alice Cooper and told him that the two greatest living artists are myself and you. That's what he said to Alice Cooper when he met him. But Yeah, so, it's called the blackout period. He doesn't remember recording, I think, like 3 albums. And, Dada is a very strange album. I don't hate it. Very strange. It's very Pink Floydish. He's working with Bob Ezrin. Bob Ezrin at this point had worked with Pink Floyd on The Wall. And you could see where maybe he wanted to give Alice Cooper that kind of Pink Floyd kind of sound. But then Alice Cooper would get clean, stop doing drugs, and then 3 years later he would put out his next album, Constrictor. Now this was Alice Cooper's entry into glam metal. And, he had Kip Winger in the band playing bass, and he had Kane Roberts in the band playing guitar. They put out the album Constrictor, and there was a song. This is one of the first Alice Cooper things I heard as well. It was the song, I believe it was called Man Behind the Mask, and it was for Friday the 13th Part 6. I remember hearing that specifically. And apparently, I guess, Alice Cooper and Kane Roberts were a good writing team. They then put out another album, one that I like quite a bit, Raise Your Fist and Yell. It's got some good tracks on it. Songs like Freedom and songs like Roses and White Lace. And just overall, I would consider that to be a good album. Kane Roberts would leave the band to do a solo album, and he wouldn't return. Then Alice Cooper put out Trash, which he had a big hit on that with the song Poison. This was in 1989. I don't have a picture of that, but yeah, Poison was a big hit. Probably a lot of people have heard that song. Like I said, Desmond Child song. Wrote it with Desmond Child. And of the Desmond Child songs, I think that is my favorite. That's my favorite Desmond Child written song. He's written others, like Living on a Prayer, You Give Love a Bad Name, Heaven's on Fire he did for Kiss, the Bon Jovi stuff I just mentioned. Just numerous other songs. I Was Made for Loving You, I think was his first that he did with Kiss. But, yeah, so it had the Desmond Child hit. Like I said, I think that's the best Desmond Child written song, Poison. I really do. But after that, Alice Cooper then put out Hey Stupid in the 90s. He would be in Wayne's World around this time. Alice Cooper had been in some movies. Even early on, he was in a movie with Carrie Snodgrass called Diary of a Mad Housewife. The Alice Cooper Band was in that. And, yeah, the Alice Cooper Band was in that. So he would do some movies. I think he did another one called Monster Dog as well. He was in one of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies playing Freddy's father. I remember that. But he wouldn't put out a whole lot of albums in the 90s, only 2. And that's understandable because, metal at this point had kind of fallen out of favor with a lot of people. And, there was the grunge era. A lot of those guys liked metal, but it was just kind of like the marketing of it. And some of the fans of alternative music and grunge, didn't like it. And as a result, metal kind of wasn't as big in the 90s, unless you were like Pantera heavy. Bands like that seem to do pretty well. But, yeah, if you were Pantera heavy, bands like that would do pretty well. So he then put out Last Temptation, had the song Lost in America on it. And just Hey Stupid and Last Temptation were the only 2 albums he released in the 90s. Wouldn't be until the year 2000 that he would put out his heaviest album yet. And that was this one right here, Brutal Planet. Definitely a good album. I like this album. It's very heavy. He has the song Brutal Planet, Wicked Young Man, Sanctuary, Cold Machines. Some good songs on here. I definitely like that album. Now, it is heavy, and It is kind of, what you would call kind of like the industrial sound. This came out in 2000, so he was a little late in that. Nine Inch Nails and those kinds of bands had already been out. He's a little late. But, bands like Marilyn Manson and Rob Zombie were talking about how influenced they were by Alice Cooper at this point. So I see where he kind of thought, well, you know what, I'm going to kind of, put out a real heavy record too if people are into that now. I could see where he would think that. And he did put out his heaviest album in Brutal Planet. And then after Brutal Planet, you would have the next one, if I have it here, but that would be the album Dragontown. Not a fan of this album. I like the title track, Dragontown. That is about it. I think this is one of his weaker albums. A lot of fillers on this album. Not so with Brutal Planet. This is a good one. But yeah, I didn't really care too much for Dragontown. And I should say also around this time, he had the elaborate stage show as well. His daughter Calico would partake and be one of the characters in his stage show. I should mention that. Then he began to decide he was going to return to his roots because a lot of people at this time were saying, really like the original Alice Cooper band. You would hear that. You would hear people saying that, they liked the 70s music. They wanted a revival of that. So that's what Alice Cooper did with his next album, The Eyes of Alice Cooper, which is kind of a return to his original Alice Cooper band sound. A lot of people were talking about that at this point. So he put out that album, and I think, that's a good album. Then Dirty Diamonds was the next one. I believe that came out in 2005. I didn't care for that one as much, but you could kind of see where, he realizes, okay, this Detroit thing, people are starting to like it again. The White Stripes are big. I think maybe, they'll like my albums if I do something kind of in that style. I could see where he thought that at that particular moment in time. So then he put out his next album. His next album was this one right here, which was Along Came the Spider. And this is a great album. This is probably my fourth favorite Alice Cooper album. This is an underrated album for sure. I really believe he knocked it out of the park with that album. It's a concept album. It's a darker album. And I'll mention this more in the next video I do, but he did something pretty unique. And that's that rather than put out one video, he combined 3 songs into one big video, making it kind of like a mini movie. I can't think of anyone else who's ever done that. So he definitely did something unique, with this album. Along Came the Spider. But yeah, good album. Definitely a good album. But then after that, he put out Welcome to My Nightmare 2. I was not big into this album. I don't know if, it has to do with it being a sequel. I know with movies, sometimes the sequel's not as good, right? I don't know if that holds true with albums. Maybe it does. But yeah, the sequel just wasn't good. I like the Caffeine song, and I know he plays that in concert. I think the Caffeine song is good. But other than that, I wasn't big into the album. I know there's a song where he's kind of singing in auto-tune, kind of like what, you would hear like Justin Timberlake or Britney Spears do. And I don't know, I want to guess that, he did it to be funny. I would think he did. If he did it to be funny, then I can understand it. But, because he would do funny things sometimes. I know when the Spice Girls were big, he pulled off a shirt he was wearing, and he was wearing a shirt underneath that said Alice Spice. So, he would do funny things on the stage. He's considered shock rock, but a lot of what he was doing was kind of, tongue-in-cheek, kind of shocking stuff. And he will even tell you that, in the 70s you could shock people. You can't shock people anymore, but, you could shock them back in the 70s. It was easier to do that at that particular time. Now you can't, but people expect to see the elaborate stage show. Once you kind of do that, and you stop with the guillotines and all that stuff, and all the other things, people are going to be upset because they expect it. So his next album was Paranormal, right here. I know Alice Cooper's into like a lot of paranormal type TV shows and stuff. This is his next album. I think a very good album. I liked it a lot. Then, just recently, he came out with his most recent album, and that's this one, Detroit Stories. Detroit Stories. Now, me personally, I do like this album. I could see where it would take a few listens to kind of get into. It's still, going back to his original sound, but, I could see where some people might not like it. But yeah, he did return to, his original sound, maybe a little different. I know there's some covers on here. There's a Velvet Underground cover. There's another song on here, Social Debris, which he did with the original with members of the original Alice Cooper band. There's another song that they did. I think it's called I Hate You, and it was written by the bass player Dennis Dunaway, and it's members of the band talking about, why they hate each other, just kind of in a kind of very tongue-in-cheek sort of way. Yeah, so you had that song on. There's another one called Our Love Will Change the World, which sounds very Beatlesy. Maybe like one of the more Beatles-sounding things that he'd done. But the song was actually, written by a band called Outrageous Cherry, and it came out in 2005. So, also, interesting album cover. I like this album cover. It's kind of a Batman kind of look to it. Definitely does. I, do like this cover. But some people don't. But yeah, I think it's a cool cover. Reminds me a lot of this cover right here. And this was to a movie called God Told Me To. Very similar, right? Very similar between the two, I think. The God Told Me To album cover and this one. Which, by the way, if you've never seen the movie God Told Me To, I definitely recommend checking it out. It's a good movie, definitely a forgotten gem. It's not what you think it might be if you've never seen it. I mean, it's a very creative and unique story. But, yeah, so that is my video on the Alice Cooper Band. Like I said, there's going to be 2 videos, so please do come back. I'm going to do another video. In this next video, I'm going to talk about my 10 favorite Alice Cooper albums, and I'm also going to talk about 5 I don't like. So see you then.